Welcome to Cannabis 360, your source for cannabis and psychedelic industry news, interviews, and insights. Visit canna360.ca and sign up to receive free access to the entire Cannabis 360 catalog. In this episode of High Fidelity, we speak with Matthew Buccioni, Infection Prevention and Biosecurity Specialist for Virox Technologies. Matthew covers the key aspects related to cleaning, sanitation, and disinfection, and the steps producers need to follow in order to optimize the sanitation program within their production facility. Hi, Matthew. How are you today?
Good. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Really excited to have you in today. So, yeah, I think really excited to chat with you today. I think a really important topic, and I think one that's often forgot about when we're thinking about the regulated cannabis market, but is really critical in terms of your facility and operations and just the overall industry as a whole. And that's sanitation and disinfection. So again, not a topic I think that people think about all too much, but anyone who's worked directly in a facility understands just how critical of a component that this is to the industry. So really excited to sort of break this down, get a better understanding of sanitation and disinfection practices, how it applies, and sort of the fundamentals of it. So yeah, thanks for being with me today. Want to start off though, can you just tell me a little bit about yourself, sort of how you got into this side of the industry and what you do at Virox?
Sure, absolutely. So I would definitely still consider myself to be new to the cannabis industry, and definitely am trying to learn as much as I can about it and try to get as much exposure in this exciting field. In terms of my background, I come from a more of a biomedical science background. And when I started with the company initially with Virox, I was more focused on the animal health sector. So focusing on veterinary clinics, shelters, but you'd be really surprised in how much of a parallel there is between infection prevention and cleaning and disinfection in sort of more healthcare and different types of medical environments, and really how that translates to other industries such as cannabis. So more recently, I've also been gaining exposure to other industries, including cannabis, and really working with facilities on infection prevention best practices as it relates to cleaning and disinfection to prevent the spread of disease within licensed producers and within other types of cannabis facilities.
Amazing. Yeah, no, that is really interesting, sort of the crossover between that. And I do know Virox works in a lot of sort of different areas, right? Like you mentioned, hospital, animal, veterinary clinics, and then cannabis as well being a big one. So yeah, again, wanting to start off with sort of some of the basics here around sanitation and disinfection. So what is the difference between cleaning, sanitizing, and disinfecting?
So that's a really great question because, especially in recent years, these are terms that I think we've heard thrown around a lot, almost interchangeably, but they actually each mean something quite different. So when we talk about cleaning, this is the process of physically removing dirt and debris from a surface. So whether that's, dry cleaning dirt off a surface with a cloth or using a detergent to, target those soils and really lift them off the surface. But the important distinction here is that cleaning by itself doesn't necessarily mean that pathogens are being killed. So, pathogens might be removed because they're being lifted off the surface, but it's not, by any means a guarantee that enough pathogens are going to be killed in order to prevent the spread of infection. So that's where some of those other terms like sanitizing and disinfecting come in. So sanitizing this one might be surprising to some people. When we talk about sanitizing, this actually means reducing the number of bacteria on a surface. So, and the important distinction here is that it's not necessarily going to cover other types of pathogens like viruses or fungi. So you might hear sanitizing being used in the context of viruses like coronavirus, for example, but in reality, this doesn't make a lot of sense because registered sanitizer products will only be tested against bacteria. So, to cover those other types of pathogens, that's where disinfecting comes in. So disinfecting is the process of killing pathogens on a surface, and that can include bacteria, but also viruses and fungi as well. And so I guess we'll touch on maybe in a minute why disinfecting is so important in the context of cannabis facilities. But those really are the distinctions there. And within cannabis facilities, cleaning and disinfecting really work hand in hand. So cleaning is important to get that dirt and debris, the resins and any other kind of organic, soils off the surface. And then the disinfection step is what's actually going to kill those pathogens and make the surfaces and tools safe.
Interesting. Yeah. So it's not one or the other. It's a combination of these things. They work together hand in hand, like you said. Interesting though, like again, it's not like you said, these words are kind of used interchangeably. So I think it is important to make those distinctions, right? So what are some of the most common pathogens that you might encounter in a cannabis facility? What should people really be watching out for, sort of the biggest areas of concern in regards to that?
Sure. So I guess to step back a little bit, when we talk about pathogens in general, we can really think about these as fitting into three different groups. And these are viruses, bacteria, and fungi. And so within cannabis facilities, the major concern is those fungal pathogens, the fungi. And these include things like powdery mildew, gray mold, fusarium, botrytis, various fungal pathogens that are able to infect cannabis plants. Sometimes bacteria might be a concern as well. So pathogens like Pseudomonas is an example. And then when we think about viruses, the interesting thing about viruses in the context of LPs is the ability to infect us humans. Things like coronavirus is obviously one that's been in the news a lot over the past couple of years, but also regular seasonal infections like influenza viruses, rhinoviruses, common cold and flu viruses. These can also have a really big impact as well, not so much in the context of plant health, but in the context of employee health and, being able to, to have everybody in and working and not have a lot of absences due to illness. So that's really where viruses are maybe a little bit less obvious, but still important, but for different reasons.
Interesting. Yeah, I think you definitely mentioned at least the ones that I hear a lot about in terms of, and good to know that like which category that they fall in. But yeah, things like powdery mildew, botrytis, those seem to be sort of at the top of the list in terms of the problems there. But you bring up an important point as well. It's not just the plants, it's not just disinfection and sanitation so that you can just pass a lab test. There's also employee health and safety that needs to be considered as well. I think that's really a critical point. So thanks for bringing that up. Now, let's kind of talk about implementing a sanitation program and a cleaning and disinfection program into a facility. Sort of what are the steps that you need to take in order to optimize that? Is there sort of a standard blueprint, at least, that some people can follow?
Sure. So there's definitely best practices that we'll recommend for any facility looking to, whether they're looking to implement cleaning and disinfection protocol for the first time, or they're looking to elevate current protocols to meet their needs. And so it really starts from, as a starting point, we recommend, assigning roles and responsibilities within a team just to make sure that everyone's on the same page. So making sure that everyone is aware of who's accountable for making sure that surfaces are being cleaned and disinfected. Just taking the time to get the whole team on board is really an essential step for that accountability, because even the best protocol in the world, even if everything else is there that needs to be there, there can be gaps and important things can be missed if there's communication issues or if people aren't on the same page about what's going to be required. And then the next step is really to make a list of all the surfaces throughout the facility that are going to need to be cleaned and disinfected. And for each of those surfaces, to think about what risk level is going to be associated with each surface. And the risk level really depends on a few different factors. There's no one size fits all. It's going to be a little bit different for every facility. But the way that you can think about risk levels is, for instance, plant contact surfaces or might be considered a high risk versus, a storage area or an area that's kind of like not part of production might be considered a lower risk for infection, just based on what that surface is being used for. And then once that list is kind of established, the next step is really to think about how potential pathogens are getting around within a cannabis facility. So thinking about mode of transmission. For some fungal spores, what this might look like is airborne transmission if the spores are suspended in the air. And then so prevention strategies might deal with, maintaining proper circulation, allowing proper space between plants to prevent that. In other cases, pathogens might be spread by direct contact between plants. So, some strategies might involve minimizing that contact and also thinking about the potential for spreading pathogens on contaminated hands or gloves, and so avoiding that. And another main way for pathogens to be transmitted is through what we call fomites. And by fomites, really what we're talking about is any type of environmental inanimate surface or object that can transmit pathogens from one plant to another. So in cannabis facilities, this could look like, tools that are used on, multiple plants. It could be work surfaces. It could be really any type of surface that, could either be indirectly touched by a plant or by people, and potentially lead to the spread of infection that way. And so thinking about what those different modes of transmission are can really help inform what the prevention strategies are that are going to be appropriate. And really what we're going to focus on is that fomite transmission. So the cleaning and disinfection to prevent the spread of pathogens on contaminated surfaces. So once that list is established, the next step is really choosing the right disinfectant to meet the needs of, your specific facility. And we can get into a little bit more about what that looks like and really what the criteria are and the checklist that you can think about as you're evaluating different products and trying to choose the right one. But once you have the product chosen that you're going to use, it's also important to make sure that the entire team is being trained on how to use the product properly, that the proper tools are provided to use the product, and that they're made, readily accessible so that, you can minimize unnecessary cross-contamination. And then the last phase is really that validation phase. So the quality control and the compliance monitoring to make sure that cleaning and disinfection protocols are working properly and that there's no critical gaps that might lead to the spread of infection.
Perfect. That was a great breakdown. So sort of assemble the team, conduct a risk assessment, and then choosing the right disinfectant and then validating the program, right? It makes a lot of sense, and it's good to have it broken down. And sort of, I think it can be a daunting task when people are, potentially first starting up a cannabis facility and having to implement, this program that I think is really the cornerstone and in some ways the backbone of the regulated cannabis industry, right? In terms of providing a safe supply of cannabis that has been tested. It really all starts there. So yeah, I want to follow up on sort of what you mentioned there, and that is selecting the ideal disinfectant. So you touched on it a little bit there, but what are some of the common traits that you should really be looking for when making that decision?
Yeah, so I guess the first thing that I should mention is that in Canada, disinfectants are regulated products. So they're regulated with Health Canada is the regulatory authority that oversees the registration of disinfectants. And so the disinfectant should be registered properly with Health Canada, and it will carry what's called a DIN, or a drug identification number. So that's the first thing to look out for, is to make sure that you are using a registered disinfectant, because that means that the data on the efficacy and the safety of the product is going to be submitted to Health Canada, and they're going to be reviewing and approving that in order for the claim to appear on the product label. So that's really the first thing to look for, just to ensure that the product is is properly registered. Beyond that, the first thing to think about is the efficacy of the product. So making sure that it kills what it needs to in the context of the common types of pathogens that are going to be seen in the facility. So in the context of cannabis facilities, as we discussed earlier, fungi are the main category of pathogen that are going to be a concern to LPs. So choosing a fungicidal product is important, and that means looking for a product that actually has use directions for fungi on the label, that it says that it's fungicidal. The surrogate organism for fungicidal efficacy is trichophyton. So if you're looking at a label, that's a claim to look out for specifically. And so that's probably the key thing in terms of efficacy, but it's also good to look for a product that is effective against other types of pathogens as well, including viruses and bacteria. So when it comes to viruses, we think of them as sort of fitting into two different groups. There's the enveloped viruses, and those are the easy to kill viruses. But then there's also some viruses that are non-enveloped, so they don't have this lipid layer around them. And that actually makes them harder to kill, which is a little bit counterintuitive. But those viruses are more resistant to disinfectants. So, choosing a product that is a Health Canada registered broad spectrum viricide means that you're getting a product that has been tested against hard to kill viruses. And that gives confidence that it's going to be effective against other viruses as well, including other hard to kill viruses, as well as obviously the easier to kill viruses as well as both gram positive and gram negative bacteria. So, in Canada, a hospital level disinfectant is going to carry claims against both Staphylococcus and Pseudomonas. And those are sort of the surrogate organisms that are used to represent gram positive and gram negative bacteria. So then in terms of efficacy, those are some of those key claims to look out for. It's not about having the longest list of claims possible. It's not about the number, it's more about the quality and making sure that all those key claims are there that's going to ensure the product's going to be effective. But in terms of efficacy, there's more to efficacy than just the claims on the label. It also is going to require a specific contact time in order to be effective. And so contact time is the length of time that a disinfectant needs to stay wet on the surface in order to be fully effective. And every disinfectant product is going to have a certain contact time. So no product is going to work instantly when you apply it to the surface. There's going to be a certain amount of time that it's going to need to be effective. And this can range, anywhere from 3 to 5 minutes, all the way up to 10 minutes in some cases. Even consumer products are going to have a contact time on the label. Even if it's not something that people may think about a lot, it will say somewhere that it needs to stay wet for a certain period of time. So choosing a product with a short contact time is also something that will really help streamline protocols and also help ensure compliance. So for instance, if you're using like a wipe or a spray product for those smaller surface areas that has a 10-minute contact time, you might need to apply the product a couple times to make sure that it's not drying prematurely before it's able to disinfect properly. Whereas if you pick a product with a shorter contact time, like a 3-minute contact time, it's a lot easier to get that compliance in just a single application. With concentrates, if you're foaming down large areas, you may be less concerned about contact time for those types of surfaces. If you're foaming down, it's a different application method, but still looking for a product with a shorter contact time can just help, streamline protocols and, spend less time turning over rooms versus those longer contact times where you might need at least 10 minutes. So in terms of efficacy, so we talked about claims, contact time. Another important aspect is the cleaning capabilities or the detergency properties that a disinfectant is going to have. So, earlier I touched on how cleaning and disinfection work hand in hand. So you need that cleaning to get rid of dirt and debris. But then the disinfection step is what's actually going to be killing the pathogens, killing the fungi, viruses, and bacteria on the surface. In terms of disinfectants, though, some products are one-step cleaner disinfectants, meaning that they have detergents or surfactants built into their formulation, and they can clean and disinfect at the same time. So the real advantage to this is that, those products are going to be effective on a surface, even if it hasn't been pre-cleaned with a separate detergent product. So if you can picture, like, obviously dealing with a lot of resins, a lot of organic debris on a surface in a cannabis facility, that's where the one-step cleaner disinfectants really come in handy, because you're going to be removing sort of the major content, like the major dirt and debris, the visible dirt and debris on the surface. Like, either like you can dry clean that surface potentially, but then you can use the one product to clean and disinfect the surface at the same time. In contrast to this, if you're using a solution like pure isopropyl alcohol or pure bleach solutions, these solutions don't have detergents or surfactants built into the formulation. And so they may not be effective on a surface unless it's been pre-cleaned with a separate detergent product. And so the one-step product really just helps, again, going back to streamlining protocols, helps use one product instead of adding additional products and additional time to the process. So that's something to look out for as well. And then the next thing to look for comes to a long-standing myth in the world of disinfectants, and that is, as it relates to safety. It used to kind of be, it used to be the case that there was a necessary trade-off between effectiveness against pathogens and safety to the user. People assume that a disinfectant is toxic by nature. That means that it is, you're dealing with harsh chemicals, just as a consequence of what you're trying to do. But that doesn't have to be true today. There are formulations out there that are highly effective against pathogens, but that don't compromise whatsoever on user safety, that at the in-use concentrations, they're going to be non-irritating to eyes, non-irritating to skin, and are not going to be associated with any other health hazards. That also may not require the use of personal protective equipment. The PPE may be worn anyway as part of normal SOPs, but the important distinction is that, it's good to look for a disinfectant where PPE is not required from a safety standpoint when handling the product. So that's just something I wanted to point out as well. And then when we talk about safety, there's safety to the user, but also we can think about safety to surfaces. So obviously, the equipment used in facilities is a really significant investment. So we want to make sure that the product is not going to cause corrosion or wear and tear on surfaces over time. And then environmental safety is also another aspect to think about. So choosing chemicals wherever possible that are going to be biodegradable, that are going to have an active ingredient that breaks down, that doesn't stick around in the environment after use. So it's not going to accumulate in the environment and pose any concerns for toxicity to aquatic life or to natural environments. And then the last thing to look for is just to look for a product that is convenient and that works for your facility. So depending on what you're looking for, if you want a pre-moistened wipe product for certain areas, based on the convenience of being able to have the wipe that you have the cleaning step built in, that's something to consider. For concentrate products, those might be convenient for larger surface areas, designed to be diluted in water. For concentrates, it's good to look for solutions that have a long shelf life once they're diluted, so that you're not constantly worrying about, that diluted concentrate expiring and, having to replace solutions on a regular basis. So just that ease of application and choosing a product that really fits in with your protocols is really the last piece to look out for.
All right. Yeah, I mean, it's a more complicated answer than you'd think, right? There's a lot that goes in to choosing the right product and what's going to work best depending on the situation. Brought up a lot of good ones: contact time, efficacy. Love the fact that you mentioned sustainability and impact on the environment as well. I think that's really critical. Something I think that the cannabis industry is working on constantly in terms of improvement. So I guess finally, I just wanted to ask, like, sort of what are some of the common mistakes that should be avoided when you are implementing cleaning and sanitation protocols within a cannabis facility?
Sure. So one of the key mistakes goes back to some of those definitions that we spoke about earlier. So the difference between cleaning, sanitizing, disinfecting. So I'd say the first is just understanding the difference there and making sure you're not mixing up the terms and using a product that might not be properly registered to be effective against the pathogens that are of most concern. So making sure that the product is a disinfectant and that it's going to have fungicidal efficacy to make sure that that those key claims, those key organisms are going to be covered. The next one comes down to working with concentrates. A lot of LPs like to use concentrates because of the convenience of being able to cover large surface areas with a small volume of chemical, because you're able to dilute it in water and really make it go a long way. And that's perfectly fine. Concentrates are great, but when it comes to dilutions, a common mistake that we'll see sometimes is eyeballing dilutions rather than having a system to measure them more precisely. In terms of measuring them precisely, whether that's measuring by hand or setting up a mixing station that's going to automate the process is important. And really the downside to, going by the eyeball method and, is the risk of improper dilution. And, if if it's under diluted, so if your solution is too strong, this could result in, wasted product if you're using more than you have to. There's no advantage to using a stronger dilution than what's required on the label. But the downside, depending on the product you're using, is there may also be occupational safety concerns with using a disinfectant that's too strong. Usually it's going to be validated for the safety information on the label is going to relate to the dilution that is required. And so if you're using a stronger solution, that's something that could potentially come up. On the other hand, if you're over diluting, if you're making a solution that's too weak, the result of this is that it just might not be effective against those pathogens of concern. It might not be strong enough to get the job done properly. And kind of related to this is, something that we also recommend is to avoid mixing the disinfectant with any other chemicals. Unless it specifically says on the label to mix it with any other type of solution. And this really comes back to those same reasons. So, almost the best case scenario might be that you end up using an over diluted or ineffective solution. But whenever you're mixing chemicals, there is also the potential for something worse in the form of potentially hazardous reactions between chemicals that might be mixed together. So that's something that we like to call out as well. The next kind of bucket in terms of mistakes that we'll see is just in general being unaware of the different conditions that are required for the disinfectant to be effective. And this could be, knowing whether the product is a one-step or two-step product. So knowing whether the surface needs to be pre-cleaned in order for the product to be effective. Keeping in mind the shelf life of the product, whether that's the shelf life of the stock solution that you buy or the diluted concentrate if you're going that route, and also the required contact time. And in terms of contact time, a common mistake that we'll see, and this is definitely not unique to the cannabis industry in any way, this is across anywhere disinfectants are used, is the tendency to spray a surface with disinfectant and then immediately wipe that surface dry. Going back to the discussion on contact time, the fact that the surface does need to remain wet for that certain length of time, immediately wiping the surface dry is guaranteeing that the contact time is not going to be reached and that the disinfection is not going to be necessarily effective. And then I think the last one really just ties into one of the first steps in building a protocol, which is getting that buy-in and training for the entire team that's going to be using the product. Even if the product is highly effective and hits all the right points, it's just not going to work properly if the team, first of all, doesn't want to use the product because maybe they don't like it or they're not like. They're not on board with it if facilities are making the switch, or they have not been provided with the proper training and the tools in order to use that product properly. So the buy-in and the training are definitely areas that we emphasize as well.
Yeah, 100%, getting everyone on board, being on the same page. But yeah, thank you for going. I mean, those are all can definitely see how those could become common mistakes and problems that happen in the industry, and outlining, watching out for that, I think is really critical. So thank you for that. Now, before we go, I did want to mention a really great resource that people can tap into, which is the infection prevention guide that Viroxx provides, and covers everything we just touched on in detail, and I think is a really, really good resource that people can turn to if they are wanting to learn more about sanitation, disinfection, and sort of some of these common mistakes and how to pick the right one and that sort of thing. So we will be linking that down below, but and also to we'll have a link to how you can contact Matthew and the team at Viroxx to answer any of your questions that you do have about cleaning and sanitation products or needs. So just wanted to say thank you, Matthew. Really appreciate that. It was really great to have you in and speak today about sanitation and disinfection. I think we will be in touch again. There's definitely some more questions, I think, and topics that we could cover in this area, but really appreciate you being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.